Hello everyone, welcome back to week 9 where I'm making Paul's Danish Cornucopia. This is essentially a sculpture that involves gluing cookies together with caramel. I thought it couldn't get any more ridiculous than that lemon stuffed dessert, but here we are. Let's see how it goes. The cookie dough for this recipe was super simple and had only 4 ingredients. It had almond flour, powdered sugar, egg whites, and almond extract. So it came together really nicely. And the recipe didn't specify which type of almond flour. I used unblanched, and I think I should have used blanched for a cleaner look. I have both now, and I discovered that the difference is unblanched, which is what I use, has the skin of the almonds and is ground raw almonds, whereas blanched is blanched slightly and doesn't include the almond skin. So it gives you kind of a cleaner look. And I didn't use that, probably should have. That's why my cookies turned out a little bit speckled. This recipe required printing out a template, and what that had you do was weigh out the piece of dough for each cookie, shape it according to the template, and then form it into increasingly bigger sized rings, which would create the sculpture. I had a little bit of dough left over, so I made an S cookie, and this was great because then I also got to taste it before I assembled the sculpture. Yay! I found that as the weeks go on, these bake-off challenges have these minor extra details that I don't think are really necessary, but I'm guessing the intent is just to make things a little bit more complicated for the bakers in the tent. For this recipe, that was making these chocolate scrolls, which required printing out yet another template and tempering chocolate and then putting it in a piping bag and piping that into scroll shapes. I'd never piped melted chocolate before, and it was actually quite fun. The only problem was once I piped it onto the acetate sheet, set it aside to let it cool, I could not get the scrolls off of the sheet. Not sure why this is. Maybe I should have put it in the fridge after. I also noticed that the cocoa percentage in the chocolate I used was slightly different than what the recipe called for, so maybe that was it. Or it could have just been human error. So I was only able to get 1 scroll out of a good 20 off of that sheet. So I decided not to put them on in the end, but that's all right. Can't win them all. This recipe also called for making an icing that used egg whites. The first batch I made just came out way too thick and it was nearly impossible to pipe, and I was also nervous about eating raw egg whites. Curious what other people think about that. So I almost gave up, but then I decided to whip up a new batch that just used powdered sugar and a little bit of water, and that worked perfectly, and I bet you can't even tell the difference which is which. So after I attempted those chocolate scrolls, it was time to make the caramel, which was the glue for this sculpture. So the caramel worked pretty well, and by some miracle, this thing held together. My version of the sculpture didn't quite curl up like it was supposed to in the picture for the recipe, but I'm gonna call it a win because it held together and it looked somewhat like a cornucopia. It even stayed together overnight until the morning when my family and I decided to tear it down and we dug in. These cookies were delicious. They're also gluten-free because the only type of flour used is almond flour. They're chewy, they're a little bit crispy on the outside. They taste a little bit like French macaroons. I also thought that once baked, these little cookies looked a lot like bagels. So what I did is, a few days after I made this recipe, I was inspired to make little mini bagel cookies using the same cookie recipe as the base. I decorated it with a sweet everything bagel topping that I made, and they turned out quite good. Take a look. This recipe was really fun to make and assemble. I would definitely make the cookies again. I probably wouldn't go for the sculpture if I did this again, but you never know. Have you ever made something like this? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you next week for the final recipe, number 10.